Thank you. I want to express my thanks to the institution. I had a chance to lecture here probably 13 years ago and was a great experience. And I just want to say up front, I have so much appreciation for Corey. He's done a fantastic job. I've done a lot of these sort of events, and he has been a fantastic coordinator of it. And just to say that all of these gentlemen who are participating have read their work, know about them, admire them, and Dr. Wellham, your son, one of my favorite students that I ever had, ever. And who is still serving in Washington, D.C., right? Senator Mike Lee still? Okay, Ted Cruz. So he's done Ben Sass, Mike Lee, and Ted Cruz. That's pretty impressive, yeah, including maybe a congressman or two along the way. So he's done well. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a Baptist view of the state. Now, it's hard to think about Baptists without thinking about their critique and rejection of Christendom and its established churches. From the Baptist perspective, partnership with the state corrupted the church and cheapened faith, thus leading to a widespread hypocrisy and a watered-down nominal form of religion. In the same way the Reformation sought to redirect the church towards Scripture, the Baptists sought to return to a more scriptural model of the church, unbound from the state, and to a model of baptism more appropriate to the model observed in the New Testament. No longer would baptism essentially coincide with entering the civil political community. On this understanding, God has given the church the task of evangelism, worship, and discipleship. He has given the state a mission that is moored to the temporal. It is geared toward protection more than perfection. This can be overstated, but I think the general idea is correct. Now, what makes government different from every other institution of human society, and this is really important, is its legal monopoly on the coercive use of force. In fact, if I were to give you sort of a social scientific definition of what makes government different from every institution in society, it would be that, the legal monopoly on the coercive use of force. This coercion is suitable for the restraint and punishment of various threats, such as crime and invasion, but it's inappropriate to matters of faith. A coerced faith is without value and promotes hypocrisy and violence to the conscience. Roger Williams famously described forced religion as a stench in the nostrils of God. While the idea of a Christian establishment in the government holds fascination and appeal for believers, the historical precedents are not encouraging. The places that held on to or continue to hold on to established churches are the places in the world where secularism is at its strongest point and where the church is weak and often compromised. See the churches of England and Sweden, for example. Now, while I don't often have the occasion to quote Karl Marx, I can't help but mischievously appreciate his observation that the Church of England would rather compromise 38 of its 39 articles before it would give up 1/39 of its income. Now, that may be unfair, but it sums up much of what we've seen from churches tied too closely to government authority. Now, in short, church establishments violate freedom of conscience and tend to promote compromised religion. There are good theological, philosophical, and pragmatic reasons to oppose them. Now, if you accept the idea of religious liberty, that leads to other ideas about the nature of the state. If we believe that religious liberty should exist, then that means there is an area in which the state is forbidden to act or in which its actions are constrained in some way. To say that the state can and should be constrained is to reject the concept of a total or comprehensive government and to embrace the idea of limited government. If we agree with the idea of limited government, then the question is, what are the different ways in which it might be usefully limited without crippling it and preventing it from carrying out the tasks with which it is entrusted and which we need it to accomplish? Now, it's not surprising that as I consider the question, I come to American-style conclusions, being an American. But I think it is more than my cultural location, which leads me to believe to think that a belief in religious liberty sits well with other features found in limited government, such as free speech, a free press, the right to assemble and petition, etc. Religious liberty protects the idea of the individual as someone who has important interests, such as their soul, that can be legitimately distinct from the state. These things flow together. Now, it's also important to understand that part of what drives the insistence upon a limited state is our recognition that human beings are sinful, which includes those who wield power as ministers of the state. Given our understanding of government as the institution in society with a unique license to use coercive force, then Christians should appreciate the necessity of limitations and boundaries upon the exercise of that coercion. One can also see why free speech and other associational rights are needed to protect the ability to criticize the state and to try to correct it. Now, if I were to attempt to develop a useful phrase to describe an appropriate Baptist view of the state, I might say something like that we believe government can draft you into an army, but not a religion. I would add that Baptists easily resonate with the need to hold the state accountable to laws rather than to men, and should protect citizens, which I would hold as a better designation than subjects for human beings made in God's image and sharing in rule over the creation, in their capacity to give and receive justifications for state action. Now, what I've set out so far, suggests fairly wide parameters for the state. There are many possible variations in terms of policy and political arrangements within these boundaries. I actually don't think there is a great deal to say in this forum specifying what those should be. But the reason for that is that the great majority of the activity in which the state engages occurs within the zone of prudence. In other words, these things don't take on the character of theological doctrine where compromise risks heresy. I think that David Van Drunen is convincing when he argues that the state should largely operate along the lines of practical wisdom. As an example, he points to the emphasis one sees in Proverbs on industriousness. A Christian should probably try to encourage his or her government to use wisdom in policymaking of the type that would not undercut industriousness. But this kind of wisdom can be possessed by any human being. It is of the type that Roger Williams said he found among the Indians, which led him to believe there are general principles of leadership and rule that can be beneficial for all peoples. The other point that Van Drunen makes about the Christian view of the state, and one which I think is wise for Baptists to adopt in light of their primary concerns, is that we should encourage it to be modest. He uses the language of protectionist rather than perfectionist. The state should be modest in its evaluation of the common good and of justice and of its own ability to achieve these things, especially given that its force is coercive in nature and that the users of that force share in the sin nature. The governments that have been the most ambitious in pursuing some high vision of the common good or justice have tended to be the greatest violators of human rights. Virtually all of history's greatest villains have had government power behind them. Three of the most ruinous, Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, inhabited the same century and aimed at almost eschatological outcomes. As Christians, as the church, as Baptists, we should acknowledge that we will not produce a detailed Christian public policy deserving of an exclusive imprimatur. It will be possible for us to argue that various policies are acceptable from a Christian point of view, but not to define specifics as the Baptist or the Christian policy. We're better positioned to argue in terms of boundaries and then to deal with specifics from the position of a more generic wisdom basis. Now, I also want to highlight a point made by the Baptist Congressman Brooks Hayes, who wrote in the 20th century, which was racked by totalitarianism and authoritarianism, that Baptists can work with a variety of political regimes as long as they maintain religious liberty and freedom of conscience. In so saying, Hayes underlined the great Baptist emphasis on evangelism and missions. By remaining as politically open as possible, Baptists could maximize their opportunity to preach the gospel in the widest set of political communities possible. There are some extremely pressing problems into which Baptists do need to speak today. We have traditionally been eager to defend religious liberty, but the nature of the challenge has shifted radically. We've gone from a union of church and state that threatened the purity of the church to a union of state and ambitious secular progressivism that contemplates the direct defeat of the church. Let me offer an example, and I apologize, I have a drag queen example. But it's a useful illustration. So let us imagine a class of third graders in public school. The day's activity is that a drag queen will come in and read a children's story comparing the change of a caterpillar into a butterfly to the transformation of a man into a colorful drag queen. Parents might protest, but there would be considerable uncertainty as to the proper basis upon which to found their disagreement. We no longer live in a society that is sure at all that drag queens should not encourage children to engage in a similar quest. Now imagine a second situation. The teacher of a class of third graders in public school invites a local female businesswoman, merchant, to come to the class and read. She shares a Bible story and a song. I think we generally understand that this second exercise is likely to be policed as an Establishment Clause violation. Church-state boundaries are pretty scrupulously enforced in public education settings, and we understand why. If the Christian merchant were replaced by a Muslim one, some of us would be concerned. But how is it that the damage done to the parents of the children and the children themselves in the second class is greater than that done in the first? Assuming there are parents of the first group of third graders who are troubled by the drag queen phenomenon, is the offense against their conscience and sensibilities any smaller? The answer is obviously no. But we also know what the rejoinder would be from secular progressives, which is that they can make no allowance for bigotry and hate. This takes me to another aspect of Christian and Baptist thinking about the state that doesn't receive enough attention. The United States has a well-established belief in the consent of the governed. Had you proposed to the founding group that consent would become all, they would have been gravely concerned and generally acted against the possibility of majorities inflamed by their passions. They acted structurally in important ways, famed checks and balances, the timing of elections so that the entire government is never up for election at the same time, federalism, and they also relied upon religion, as in the example of the Northwest Ordinance and funding for missionaries to the Indians, to attempt to build and maintain virtue. The consent of the governed, unmodified by God's authority and no longer tethered to his creation order, has become a kind of an idol. Maybe it always has been. David Koyzis presents it as such in his Political Visions and Illusions. Now, we can observe that in previous times, voters and governments acted heedless of the existence of God's image in African men and women to deny them their rights and to treat them as property. The deafness of the current age and the corresponding shouting that goes with the deafness has settled in with regard to gender, sexuality, and other matters related to personal autonomy, such as the unjust taking of unborn lives. It is important that Baptists engage the people in churches and those with whom we interact in evangelism and missions to understand the more authentic nature of government authority, which is that God's authority is the source upon which all lesser authority depends. When we recognize that, then we can understand there is a zone of action which is not simply open to our collective or majority wishes, whatever those may be. Attempting to fundamentally alter God's creation order is the kind of betrayal that invokes Adam's sin and the apparent arrogance of Babel. There are two sources of government authority, but they are not co-equal or freestanding. Government by consent, and they are all ultimately governments of consent, one way or the other, sit on the foundation of God's greater authority. And we live in a world that increasingly rejects the existence of any authority from God other than cheering us on in whatever we wish to pursue. A society that specifies God's role for him in such a way would seem to be in terrific danger. Having offered a description of what I'm calling a Baptist view of the state and a challenge, I want to turn further in the direction of modern problems faced by Baptists and to ask an important question about where we stand. Eric Smith recently gave a great presentation to the ERLC about his book on John Leland, Baptist pioneer of religious liberty. And I asked him whether Leland could have foreseen that dismantling official Christendom would result in the development of an official secularism that simply cannot be characterized as neutral. Slowly and over time, this supposedly neutral secularism eased Christianity into the margins, where it could be gerrymandered away from legitimacy in law, government, politics, academic writing, business, and virtually any other field of endeavor outside the church. In these same places, ideologies such as Marxism, feminism, critical race theory, liberalism, and a wide variety of other frameworks of thought could operate without the limiting descriptor of religion being applied to them. Complaints about this lack of neutrality have been largely unavailing. Stephen D. Smith has written about the transformation of a positivistic secularism into what he describes as a pagan secularism. This pagan secularism represents a tremendous threat to the church, as it sees less and less need to make any pretense of neutrality toward religion, and instead acts more aggressively toward it. It has far more ideological range and romantic appeal than positivistic secularism, and I'd be happy to talk about that more in the discussion later tonight. Smith astutely observes that while the modern social and intellectual vanguard promotes their embrace of science and reason, they have been unable to live with the positivistic consequences of their view. Instead of dwelling in a darkly comic or flatly despairing world of cosmic accident and values that can be based on little more than either power or aesthetics, they seek some form of sacredness to impart meaning and some sort of foundation to the rights they believe must exist beyond their own imaginations. The result is a move over time from the Christian separation of church and state toward a positivistic secularism, which is brief, and then on to a pagan form of secularism. That which is explicitly Christian is ruled out of bounds almost as a matter of course, with little explanation other than an everyone knows sort of narrative, while the pagan secular sensibility, maybe like the one offered by Anthony Kennedy in his jurisprudence, thrives unfettered. So we arrive at our current state. The transcendent has come to be seen as dogmatic, intolerant, and as an infringement on liberty. While the Christian tradition may have helped us to develop the foundations of rights, freedoms, and limited government we enjoy, modern pagans believe they can offer a sacred grounding without the transcendent baggage through a religion that might be called immanent, that sort of comes out of our desires and from within the creation instead of above it in an authoritative position. This is the legal version of being spiritual, not religious. But the spiritual merely sanctifies the opinions and acts of the ruling class. It's the Tocquevillian dystopia complete with ostracization via cancellation. Facing this increasingly untenable situation, a number of influential figures are moving away from the separation of church and state and towards some kind of new Christendom. I've even heard some use the term Christendom 2.0. It is highly evocative, even a little exciting. There is no doubt some attraction to the idea that we will take the gloves off and stop wearing the straitjacket imposed by political liberalism. Many of us took note when Joe Rigney left his post as president of the Bethlehem College and Seminary on the basis that his beliefs no longer lined up with the Baptistic tradition and principles of the institution. For Rigney, infant baptism had become an open question. In addition, he looks for the Christianization of the civil government. The announcement characterizes his political philosophy as Christendom building. Infant baptism, of course, traditionally goes along with the unified civil and ecclesiastical order. Now, some have wondered whether Rigney would soon decamp for a place with more similar views, and that has occurred. He is taking academic and pastoral positions in Moscow, Idaho, where also is Canon Press that published The Case for Christian Nationalism. Now, the situation underscores the importance of holding an event of this type. On the left, we have progressives attempting to wholly delegitimize our views to the point of non-engagement, To them, even natural law and practical wisdom illegitimately echo the Catholic magisterium. On the right, Christians are looking back with longing at the old European Christendom. There is little doubt that this sentimentality is driven in part by the shocking speed and aggressiveness of the various revolutions launched by partisans of critical theory and institutionalized by almost every elite institution, public and private, in the United States. The question then is, are the Baptists without the backdrop of semi-established or informally established Christendom? If John Leland, for example, had known the place we'd reach in 2023, would he have persisted in this course? Would his confidence in the separation of church and state and religious liberty have been as great? Now, there's a reasonable argument to be made that the Baptists are one of the Christian groups with the strongest connection to political liberalism, not meaning the philosophy of the left. Political liberalism is the philosophy that has given us the separation of church and state, religious liberty, free speech, freedom of the press, limited government, etc. It's political liberalism that Francis Fukuyama was talking about when he talked about the end of history. Part of political liberalism would be a plausibly neutral secularism. This was, after all, a time, the 1990s, when it was believed that faith-based initiatives might be part of a constructive public policy. Certainly, it seemed that the Soviet failure had repudiated aggressive atheistic secularism. But instead of the chastening of secularism that seemed possible at that time, we've seen a version of events play out that empowers the pagan secularism that Smith wrote about, and which has left the church and Christians increasingly marginalized and vulnerable. So again, I ask, are our beliefs about church and state and Christendom the same in this new environment? To conclude and circle back to my earlier comments on the Baptist view of state, I would argue that the Baptist view of the state is the limited state paired with the regenerate church. As political liberalism becomes more and more unstable, and as our unofficial, non-established Christianity ebbs, we see more and more people reconsidering or considering the abandonment of this Baptist viewpoint in favor of a Christianized civil order. To do so, I would argue, is a dangerous step that reinvigorates the idea of the total state as opposed to the limited one. Now, Christ leaves a church to do his work, not a state. And he doesn't give the church state-like powers. We need to redouble our commitment to the church and perhaps demote our preoccupation with the state, and to trust God that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Thank you.